you ever gotten in trouble for something that you thought wasn't quite fair? I once got a parking ticket in Milton Keynes. I parked in one of the big car parks by the shopping centre. I got my ticket, I'd put it on the dashboard, and off I went. I'd come back 2 hours later, and there's one of those great big yellow stickers on my windscreen. I thought, hang on a minute, that's not fair. I bought the ticket. As I looked closer, I could see what must have happened as I'd shut my door to walk away. A little gust of wind must have just blown the ticket over. So now it was face down on the dashboard. Well, I wrote to the council. I said, look, I wasn't trying to avoid paying. I bought the ticket. I paid for it. It just blew over. I sent them a picture of my ticket. And then some Jobsworth sat in a windowless office sent me an email back saying the rules clearly state that your ticket must be clearly displayed. Furthermore, if I didn't pay in the next 30 days, my fine would double. Obviously, I'm not bitter and I've not dwelt on it for many years. But the passage we're looking at today sees Jesus in a debate about rules. He's in a debate with the Pharisees about one of the most important rules to the Jewish people. It was one of their badges of national identity. It was Sabbath. All about how people to observe the Sabbath. And Jesus gets into a debate about this. And when Mark writes these stories for us, part of the reason he does it is because he wants us to take sides. As we see the Pharisees and we see Jesus, Mark wants us to pick who we think is right. Now, many of us instinctively will think we're with Jesus. But actually, I want us to look a bit closer this morning to see perhaps there's a little bit more of the Pharisees in us than we'd like to admit. And that's a massive problem because, well, the Pharisees have a really hard time accepting Jesus and coming to him. So what we're going to do this morning is I want to show you from this little section in Mark's account of Jesus' life a 5-point Pharisee identikit. And here's the first one. You may be a bit like a Pharisee if you love rules. Pharisees love rules. Maybe you love rules. Maybe nothing thrills your heart more than a new GDPR policy. Maybe you enjoy reading them and writing them. Maybe you're the sort of person that reads the small print in every contract and you know your rights in every consumer sphere. The Pharisees loved rules. Israel had been given 10 commandments and the Pharisees had taken those and drilled down into each and every one and come up with an elaborate system of rules, which meant they didn't have 10 commandments, they had 613 commandments. Actually, when it came to Sabbath, they had 39 commandments related to Sabbath. 39 things you were not allowed to do. The Pharisees loved rules. Do you like rules? Do you love rules? Well, maybe not all rules, but maybe some rules. I happen to know that one of the rules of the highway code is you're not allowed to park within 32 feet of a junction. I don't know why I know that or why I like it, but I kind of do. It makes me feel a little bit smug and superior. What about you? Why do we love rules, or at least some rules? I think there's a sense in which they give us a certain amount of control or even power. They enable us to feel like we're in the right and to spot when others are in the wrong. That links to our second point, our second mark of a Pharisee. Not only do you love rules, you love catching rule breakers. Nothing thrills your heart more than calling foul on somebody else. And that's what happens in this passage. We've got two scenes here, haven't we? We've got Jesus with his disciples. They're walking through a cornfield. They're on a Sabbath day walk. And Jesus' disciples are picking some of the ears of corn and eating as they go. And in the first scene, the Pharisees catch them and say, verse 24, look, why they're doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath. The same kind of thing happens in the second scene where Jesus is in the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there in verse 2. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. They love catching a rule breaker. When I was at school, I don't know what you do, boys and girls, in your playtime, but we used to play football almost every playtime without exception, unless rain stopped play. And normally we'd pick sides and then we'd go at it. But we had one kid in our year who was a bit unusual. He didn't want to be on either team. He wanted to be the ref. He wanted to referee our football games. In fact, one Christmas, I think, rather than getting a football shirt for Christmas, he got a ref's kit. I think he grew up to become a town planning officer. Here's a controversial example for you this week. Dominic Cummings. Now, don't write to me. I won't reply. And I'm not here to comment on the right or the wrongs. I honestly feel not entirely qualified to comment. But what I've been interested in this week, and actually if I'm honest slightly troubled by, is the ferocity of reaction. Let me give you a couple of quotes. One writer, a minister called David Robertson, said this. He said, "My concern with it is the hysteria, the hatred, the trial by social media, and the absolute fundamentalist certainty that everyone on Twitter has." Well, how about this quote from Tim Keller in his latest book? "Many have pointed out that today our society is as moralistic and judgmental as it ever has been. We live in a call-out culture in which people are categorised reductionistically to good or evil and then are publicly shamed until they lose jobs and communities." What is that Pharisee spirit within us that loves to catch somebody and call them out and shame them? Maybe it's because there's something in us that enables us to feel a little bit more self-righteous and a little bit more superior to others. The danger of that is our third mark. This is where this kind of goes. The third mark of our Pharisee identity kit is this, that if you're not careful, you can end up loving rules more than you love people. We see that here, don't we, in this passage. Part of Jesus' answer to the accusation in the first scene is he says this in verse 27. He says, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the rules are given for the flourishing of human beings, not the enslaving of them. In the second scene, in 3:3-5, you'll see as they're watching to see if Jesus heals, Jesus brings this man out in front of them. And then Jesus said, "What is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. Do you see the danger of the Pharisees is they so love their rules and their system of religious observance that they'd forgotten people. They'd forgotten to care for people. I'll never forget the girl that started coming to church in her late 20s with a couple of little kids. And one particular Sunday, her two little kids were a little bit restless and they were making noise, which is entirely normal, and we work hard to say we're cool with that. But somebody near her tutted and shushed her. You see, in that person's minds, this lady had broken the rules, the 11th commandment, "Now children shall not make noise at church." And she never came back. See, sometimes when we start to love rules more than people, we can become incredibly uncharitable toward those who deviate from our agreed kind of processes and protocols and rules and systems of behaviour. It's not even always a sin thing. It's just we feel people ought to have done this, and when they do otherwise, we get cross and angry and we think the worst. There's a little bit of Pharisee in all of us, if we're honest. Here's the fourth mark of our kind of Pharisee identity kit is rules have made your heart hard. And sometimes it's the saddest thing in all of this, isn't it? We meet the Pharisees. They are so quick to accuse Jesus and his disciples in the first scene. And in the second, they're watching to see what Jesus will do. And do you notice this? It's very moving, isn't it? In verse 5, as Jesus looked around at them in anger, and he's deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Jesus is deeply moved and upset and distressed because of where this obsession with rule keeping has led to a hardness of heart. Boys and girls, you may have read the book or watched this movie, the Grinch film. And as the Grinch is described, I wonder if you remember this description. Let me read a little bit of it for you. It says this: the Grinch hated Christmas the whole Christmas season. Now please don't ask why, no one quite knows the reason. It could be his head wasn't screwed on just right. It could be perhaps his shoes were too tight. But I think the most likely reason of all may have been that his heart was 2 sizes too small. That's the danger, isn't it? These seriously religious rule keepers actually have shriveled hearts. They lack the care of people. It can happen to us, can't it? Instead of that fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control, we have the opposite of all those things, don't we? Hate, bitterness, anger, frustration, a harsh and abrasive manner, prone to lose our cool. Which one of those categorises you more naturally? Here's the fifth, the final mark in our Pharisee identikit. The saddest of all is that their obsession with rules actually keeps them from Jesus. Your love of rules and a system of religious obedience can actually push you further away from Jesus. Did you pick up the irony in the passage? You remember they're obsessed with right Sabbath observance, not breaking any Sabbath commandments. And Jesus says what is right, to save life or to kill. And they stay silent until the end in verse 6, when immediately the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Those who are so concerned with Sabbath obedience are on the Sabbath plotting a murder. We get a couple of other hints here, don't we, of Jesus' identity. Again, Mark is keen to keep us asking that question, who is Jesus? And when Jesus is accused, do you notice what he says in the first of the scenes? He talks about a story of David, when David and his companions were hungry. In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, they entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And there's not a strict parallel there. I mean, both involve food, but it seems like David and his companions aren't doing it on the Sabbath. But I think Jesus is doing something else here. In this section of 1 Samuel, where this story is taken from, Saul has been rejected as king, and David anointed as king by Samuel. And all of that hasn't quite worked itself out in national life. And Saul wants to kill David. And David's on the run. So what you have is the leadership of Israel rejected, seeking to kill God's anointed king. I wonder if Jesus is even here, trying to get them to see that they are Israel's leadership rejected for their evil, even here plotting to kill God's anointed king. And Jesus goes on, doesn't he? He claims even slightly more forcefully here in verse 28, where he says, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. The very rules that were given to give life, where do they come from? They come from God. So what is Jesus claiming when he claims to be Lord of these God-given rules? It's a bit like the game Guess Who, isn't it? You may have played that in your families, whereby a process of elimination and an identification of characteristics, you work out who the person is. Remember what we've seen so far. We've seen Jesus cast out demons, teach with authority, heal, forgive sin, to claim here even to be Lord over the Sabbath. Who is this man? The Pharisees' self-righteous judgmentalism keeps them from surrendering to Jesus. One of the saddest things in this story is if you read it in this kind of way that we've been looking at it, is you realise that there is something far sadder, far more tragic, actually far more urgent than the man's withered hand. It's the withered souls of the Pharisees. One writer said this: the devil's masterpiece is not the prostitute, but the Pharisee. There's the sobering warning here that it's possible to be incredibly serious about religion and to still somehow have a withered soul. What do you suppose Jesus would say to Dominic Cummings at the moment? If he met him, what would he say? Hard to know, isn't it? I suspect Jesus would find a way to be both more penetrating than we or our media could ever be, but also infinitely more gracious. And I wonder if the conversation might start with Jesus saying something like, "Let me take you and buy you a bite to eat." What would you say if you met Dominic Cummings? What would you say if he came into your church after lockdown? Or if you met him on the street? And why should those responses necessarily be all that different? Do you remember last week we saw chapter 2, verse 17, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I've not come to call the righteous, but to call sinners." Part of what these stories make us do is, to some degree, we need to see that we are Pharisees. And we need to own and identify that in ourselves. And we need to come to Jesus, recognising that we're not righteous, but we're sinners. And he comes to bring that healing, that wholeness that we need. And just one more little interesting thing to note here from this passage. The Sabbath was a day of rest. It was the day when God rested from his creation. So when Jesus starts bringing life and healing and restoration on the Sabbath, you begin to think, this is new creation. This is new wine into new wineskins. This is what he said in chapter 1, verse 15. The kingdom of God has come. And what these stories are all designed to do, what they make us do as we kind of read them and put ourselves in the story, is the story wants you to take sides. It wants you and me to decide. Actually, as we meet Jesus walking off the pages of Mark's Gospel, who do we want to be like? Whose side do we want to be on? And it reminds us of our need to keep coming as sick sinners to the healing hand of Jesus.